Anything else?
Phased plasma rifle in a 40-watt range.
Hey, just what you see, pal.
This is one of those sort of projects I felt like I just had to make. Given that I was building the Terminator, it seemed pretty obvious to me that making this gun in particular is definitely one of the accessories that should go along with the Terminator. I didn't have any physical pieces to work with this one, so I essentially had to make up all the pieces from scratch so that I had all the necessary pattern pieces to do the casting. Like a lot of my projects, I started out by doing a lot of research, sourcing pictures and dimensions and all that sort of thing, and thankfully there was quite a bit of photo information available for this one. I started out by getting a pretty good sharp photo and photoshopping out the background of it. Then I just printed it out on regular A4 paper, laminated those pieces together and cut them out to give the template piece I needed. To make sure that the dimensions I had were actually 100% correct, I reached out across the forums and found a guy that goes by the username Tony Plutoni. He owns a 1:1 scale replica that's been made up in resin, and he was gracious enough to take a lot of photos for me, and he laid a tape measure in place so that I could work out all the dimensions for all the different elements. From there I traced that piece out onto some high density foam. The type of foam that I'm using here is a insulation foam. It's quite lightweight, but the biggest reason I'm using it is that it doesn't compress very easily, which means when I use it to be packed into the sand, it won't want to collapse under the weight of me packing down on top of it. Once I've got the initial shape, I'm using that as a three-dimensional guide so that I can work out the individual pieces, so that I can start working out the individual elements, including where they may overlap, in pretty much the same way that it would be used if it was being assembled like a real weapon. And I wanted to include as much working detail in it as I possibly could. Once I had those individual pieces, I started carving them down with a mixture of different grades of sandpaper, coarse to sort of fairly fine sandpaper, just to start polishing the surface back. The biggest thing with this type of foam is you want to get rid of any sort of furry edges that might be associated with it, and I also used a soldering iron to sort of harden up areas of the foam by melting through. That created a much stiffer area around those thinner areas, so they'd be less inclined to sort of snap and break away. It did leave those areas quite rough though, so as I got closer to finishing the sculpting around that trigger area, I also reinforced it with the epoxy putty by literally just sculpting the putty directly onto the surface of the foam. Once I achieve the look I'm going for, I'll then coat the surface so that it's a hardened surface. I've just used a really sharp serrated knife to actually follow those bevel lines. The idea being to angle the blade in such a way that it picks up the top line and the bottom line at the same time, and then make your way across. That still leaves an uneven surface, but I can go over that and sand that now with a smoother sandpaper to actually bring that bevel back close to what I'm after. Whilst I'm basing what I'm building here off my reference pictures, I'm not going to keep every single element. There's little tweaks and stuff that I'm going to be doing to make this my own sculpt and my own design. I want to stay true to the original, but there are certain little elements, because I'm going to be making this from metal, like the endoskeleton, there's certain elements that I want to make, for want of a better term, a little bit more real. So this is something that I hope to be able to build and break down. It'll have to sort of stitch together properly, very much like a real gun. So as a result, some of the features that are actually in this particular one in this picture is a resin replica, and whilst it's got really good reference detail pieces on it, some of the pieces aren't going to translate into a practical working piece, so that's where I've got to try and work out the extra details. Practically speaking, usually there's nothing really what you would consider to be ornamental on a gun, so these features usually would do something, and that's really what I've got to try and work out. And whilst there was quite a lot of photographic information available, there was very little in the way of technical data that you might find if you're expecting to find this as a real weapon. I did find some fan forums that outlined some technical specifications on the rifle's capabilities, and based on that and my own ideas, I decided that I'd create a number of different blueprints outlining exactly how the gun would operate. The lower part of the gun's design was taken from a real-world weapon, which was the Calico submachine gun, and using that as a basis they then built on the other elements to give it that sort of classic bull pump sort of design. Once I had all the individual pieces carved and shaped, I then went over it with a gap filler sealant just to seal up the surface of the foam and make the outer surface that much stiffer. Once that had set and dried off, I could then sand the pieces back and they were pretty much ready for casting. From there I had to split them down the centre and start carving out the centre section. This was both to cut down the amount of weight that was associated with them as far as the cast aluminium was concerned, and also to allow for internal space for working components, as well as working out internal areas where mounting points could be tapped into the metal for all the necessary bolts and screws that would go into the assembly of it. I started out by using a soldering iron to establish an outside border, and then cut in and melt down to the necessary depth that I wanted to go to. I wanted the overall wall thickness to be around about 5 or 6 millimeters thick. That'd be more than thick enough to allow for the strength that I needed, as well as being able to cut down the weight, but still being thick enough to allow the metal to flow through the molds as I needed them to. The other advantage with working with a soldering iron is that I could allow areas like the circular piece that I'm working on here to remain as a high element that I could then tap a thread or a bolt into to mount the two shell components together. Once I'd gone over the surface with the soldering iron, I could then snap out the areas of foam that I didn't want, and whilst it left a bit of a rough surface on the inside, it really didn't matter because it's something that would never be seen. That then gave me the two pattern pieces I needed so that when the parts were cast, they could be clamshelled together and then assembled in very much the same way that a real rifle would be. Working on the parts this way also allowed me to see what sort of hollow spaces would also be available for internal components, including how and where the barrels would attach, how the magazine might click into place, as well as things like where the springs might go for the trigger mechanism. Once I had all the larger pieces worked out, I started sculpting in the smaller details across the surface of the pieces, as well as individually sculpting up the small pieces, like the pins and slides and levers. And for the finer details, I used a combination of styrene sheet pieces, and I also used epoxy putty to sculpt directly onto the surface of the foam to stiffen up areas like the trigger area that needed to be a lot stronger, and some of the other small lever components that go into the assembly of the rifle. The aluminium casting technique that I'm using, show you what the process actually is. The first thing I add to it is the powdered graphite. The idea behind that is that it acts as a separating agent and stops the sand from sticking to the pattern piece. Once I get a coating on it, it's then just a matter of gently starting to pack it down, gently at first and then harder as you go. Make sure that that separates really well. Also, the piece that you can see here at the moment, that's the internal part of the pattern. So it's the section that, for want of a better term, needs to be least tidy. Trying to keep a fairly even coating, don't want to be too aggressive. Whilst it's a fairly stiff foam, the sand is wet enough that it'll pack fairly neatly, so I don't have to go crazy with the thumping of it, because I don't want to damage the underlying pattern. I may need to get 2 or 3 or more uses out of these patterns, so I want to maintain them as best I can. The only real reason I used the foam in the first place was purely for speed. Normally speaking, I'd probably make pattern pieces out of MDF or wood or any one of a number of other ones that were more durable. But because this is a piece that I'm not likely to want to revisit over and over again, the foam means that I can whip out a prototype piece pretty quickly with a minimal degree of time and fuss. Once we've got it packed, it's just a matter of separating it and seeing what sort of mould we've got. It's picked up the top detail really nicely, so any sand that you leave in that can be effectively washed through by the molten metal is another contaminant that can be added to the mix. So it has to be as clean as you can possibly get it, and has to be free of any loose bits of sand floating around. I know it sounds a silly thing to say, but I'm trying to think backwards here as well, because I'm working in a negative medium. Everything I take away from here adds to, in terms of metal, adds metal to the mix. So wherever I actually remove sand, I've got to be thinking that that's adding either a flow point that the metal can flow through, or it's doing something to increase the amount of metal that's actually been added to the job. So these broken seam lines here, for instance, they're not terribly bad, but they will add an outer seam of metal, and I'd have to be careful if one of those ran to the edge. That would give it a spot where the mould could rupture, and that's the last thing we want. When I've set the sprue holes and riser holes down, I've put a can on top of them and then packed sand around the base of it. That sand is a little wetter than the other sand, so that it actually acts as a cool spot. You can see there how the centre of that is starting to shrink in, and this one is still quite domed up. That means that the pattern is pulling in the molten metal. Need to cut out these panels again, sort of thing, but they're quite thin, so that shouldn't be an issue. And sort of assess the overall weight at that point to see whether or not the project's even going to be a viable one. But at this stage, based on that, it's heavy, but it's not ridiculously heavy. So once the thing is built, it should be okay. The overall weight of a loaded Terminator gun, according to the statistics I've been able to find, is about 8 kilos. So if it comes within that sort of criteria, I'll be happy. And hey, only a Terminator is supposed to lift it anyway. So I've really only done a test polish on that primary piece. There's still quite a bit of cleanup to do in some of those sections, and some of these venting ports need to be cleaned up a little bit more. That's looking to be pretty promising. I'm not a huge fan of the Endo rifle being a chrome finish, but I have it in my head that this one's not going to be the Endo rifle so much as it is the prototype of the Endo rifle, and that future versions were black. And I think with this I'm actually going to do a combination of chrome and black elements. So the second set of casting I did was on the pistol grip. I've put some temporary screws in here for now so that I can start shaping and cleaning these up so that the shells go together properly. I'm pretty happy with the way that cast has come out. The lines and the venting pieces here that actually have to be cut out. So what I'm left with having to do is basically drill a series of holes along the lines on where they should be, and then either chisel them out or drill them out, and then get in there with a file and file them back to the squarer lines. These ones still need a little bit of tidying up. You can see it's a little rough around the edges there, but essentially that's the principle. So the idea as I do this is I drill a series of holes along. Depending on the type of surface you're working on, you could actually run along with a center punch out a straight line, and then drill out each hole accordingly. So once I've got those done as a guide, it's then just a matter of filling in the gaps like I've done on these ones here, to sort of close up the gaps. The other thing that I've done, which is significantly different, you can probably tell, is that the holes themselves are smaller than the gap that I'm actually trying to create. The next bit is the trickiest bit of all, where you want to mill out the leftover metal in between each hole. And the idea with that is essentially I've gone to a slightly larger drill piece. As I drill in, I'm slowly going to change the pitch of the drill to actually cut out the gaps in between each of those holes. When I get to the last hole, I can rock in that direction, but I can't rock in the other direction. If I was to rock in the other direction, it would actually cut against the outside. Once the centerpiece has basically been cut out with the drill piece, it's then just a matter of getting the file in there and filing it out to a square edge. And that's essentially the process. Time consuming, but it's worth it in the long run. All the primary parts are now cast. I've been able to find a piece of box aluminium that's very close to the proportions that I need for the magazine. I'll be adding a piece of metal to the side of it and to the base, as well as the locking mechanism for the top, and adding some detail pieces to actually finish that off, but most of those I'll be able to do by attaching pieces. Still have to cast up a couple of the little pieces, the cover for there, the trigger mechanism will need to be done as well, and the slide mechanism for the cocking mechanism, which will run on the track where be spring loaded. I've done a bit more roughing on the barrel, I've added some flanges and done a little bit more alignment on the lower stock. The upper stock I've started, I've got a big bolt there holding everything in place whilst I work out the alignment. I still need to clear up the rear connecting pieces so that I can connect the magazine. And of course I've got that piece. What is that piece, you might ask? Well, of course that is the self-grounding electromagnetic phase inducer unit.
Well, duh.
It locks into the top, like that. now. So everything's loose in one way or another. The barrels are a little bit crooked. They're sort of pointing together a little bit too much. I've still got to put the covers on. Work out the latch so that actually locks in place.
Excellent.
For your consideration, introducing the prototype for the M95A1/82 phased plasma rifle with 40-watt range. Fully electronic firing system has a backup of 100 standard ammunition rounds that are fired from the lower barrel automatically as needed, to allow for the plasma charge and cooling cycle. The primary weapon uses a multi-phase induction of plasma, created in 2 chambers and magnetically accelerated to 9,000 meters per second, and has an effective range of up to 1,400 meters before the plasma bolt loses magnetic cohesion. The combined fuel cell gas magazine uses refined hydrogen containing enough gas and energy to initiate and produce 100 plasma pulses and can either be replaced or recharged. Extensive testing has revealed destructive tunneling of target material through kinetic energy and superthermal contact. The magnetically accelerated plasma bolt can penetrate up to 10.5 centimeters of case-hardened steel. The bolt will penetrate 180 centimeters of standard ballistic gelatin, with a wound channel radiating out 10 centimeters from the point of impact. Standing liquids such as water or blood will be instantaneously vaporized, thus greatly increasing the wound radius through flash heating, causing high-velocity steam expansion and lethal bursting of soft tissues over a large area. The M95A1 plasma rifle has been developed by Westinghouse in conjunction with Cyberdyne Systems and under the Skynet Defense Program. Thank you for your attention.